In the late 1980s and early 1990s, there was a particular kind of person who made a living writing software for small businesses, writing invoicing systems, inventory systems, and customer databases that kept ordinary companies running. And if you had asked any of them what tool they used, a very large number would have given you the same answer: Clipper, a piece of software that took the database language everybody already knew and turned it into something faster, safer, and genuinely sellable. And the developers who used it built entire careers on top of it, and it grew to one of the most important development tools of its era, sitting underneath millions of applications. And then in 1992, it was bought for $190 million by a corporation that had built its entire fortune on a very specific and very cynical understanding of how the software business works. A corporation with such a reputation for what it did to the products it acquired that people in the industry had a phrase for it. They called it the place where good software goes to die. What happened to Clipper over the following 5 years is a case study in how you destroy something beloved, and in a crazy twist, the executives who ran the corporation that drove Clipper straight into the ground would eventually be marched into a federal courtroom, and one of them would go to prison for 12 years. This is the story of Clipper. Our story begins in 1984 at a lunch table in a seafood restaurant in Malibu, California. Two men were sitting there complaining, as software people do, about the state of the tools they had to work with. One of them was Brian Russell, who worked in technical support at Ashton Tate, the company behind dBASE, which at that time was one of the 3 biggest software companies in the world. dBASE was the dominant database on the personal computer, so dominant, in fact, that its language had become an industry standard. And Russell spent his days answering phone calls from the people who used it, most of the time being complaints about how the product was not working as they wanted it to. And the same request kept coming up on those calls over and over. Customers wanted a compiler. Ashton Tate had never built one and showed no particular interest in building one. So Russell turned to his lunch companion, a man named Barry Rebel, who ran a temporary staffing agency and had access to money, and suggested that they build it themselves. Following this, they needed a name for the product, and one of the men noticed a picture on the napkin in front of them: a clipper ship, because the restaurant was called the Nantucket Lighthouse. So the product became Clipper, the company became the Nantucket Corporation, and it would be a business that would end up selling 250,000 copies of a developer tool. To understand what made Clipper so immensely popular and why it mattered so enormously, you have to understand the problem it was solving. dBASE was an interpreted system, which means that when you wrote a program in the dBASE language, the computer did not run your program directly. It ran dBASE, and dBASE read your instructions line by line and worked out what to do as it went. This had 3 consequences, and every one of them was painful for a professional developer. The first was speed, because interpreting instructions on the fly is dramatically slower than running code the machine already understands. The second was distribution, because anybody who wanted to use the program he had written also needed a copy of dBASE itself, which was expensive, which meant your customers had to buy someone else's product before they could use your product. And the third consequence was the one that stung the most, because your source code, the actual instructions you had written, the intellectual property you had spent months building, sat there in plain readable text on the customer's machine, where anyone could open it, read it, copy it, or modify it. Clipper solved all 3 problems at once. It took your dBASE language source code and compiled it, turning it into a standalone executable program that ran on its own with no dBASE required, at a speed at which the interpreter could never approach. And most importantly, this was done with your source code locked away where nobody could get it at all. Clipper turned dBASE programmers into legitimate and thriving software vendors. The version that solidified Clipper as a legendary piece of software was the one released in 1987, and it was called Summer 87. It was fast, it was stable, and it simply worked. The Autumn 86 release had already added network support so that multiple people could use the same application at once, which mattered enormously to the small businesses that were Clipper's heartland. And in 1990, Clipper 5.0 changed the product's nature entirely, adding local variables and proper program structure and moving Clipper away from being merely a compiler for somebody else's language and toward being a serious programming language in its own right, with features borrowed from C and Pascal. By this point, Clipper had told sold around 250,000 copies worldwide and had been used to build millions of applications. And the New York Times ran a piece in November of 1991 on Nantucket's unusual success in the Soviet Union, where the company had managed the near impossible feat of persuading Soviet developers that buying a software was preferable to pirating it. So by 1992, Nantucket had a beloved product with a devoted professional user base and a healthy business, and that made it, naturally, a target, though the company that came for it was interested in something quite different from what Nantucket's customers valued. Computer Associates was a software company founded in 1971, and it had grown into one of the largest software companies on earth through a strategy that had very little to do with writing software. Computer Associates bought companies. It bought them constantly, dozens and dozens of them across the 1980s and 1990s, and the logic underneath the buying spree was ruthless and, in pure financial terms, actually brilliant. When a corporation runs its business on a piece of software, particularly the mainframes and enterprise software that Computer Associates specialized in, the cost of switching to something else was enormous. You would have to retrain everybody, rewrite years of integrations, and risk your entire operation on a transition. This meant that once a company depended on a product, it most likely would keep paying the maintenance and licensing fees, almost regardless of how bad the product itself got. Computer Associates understood this better than anyone, and it built a business on acquiring products that customers could not escape from, cutting the cost of developing them and collecting the revenue that flowed in anyway. The industry watched this happen again and again to product after product until the pattern acquired a nickname. Computer Associates was where good software went to die. In June of 1992, Computer Associates acquired Nantucket Corporation for approximately $190 million, and Clipper was renamed CA Clipper. What followed was a slow and quiet execution, and the trouble started almost immediately with the release of Clipper version 5.2, which arrived with many bugs and caused a lot of upset among Clipper's devoted developer community. And then came the decision that made everything worse and might as well actually have killed Clipper. By the mid-90s, the world was changing. Windows was taking over, and every DOS-based development tool on the planet faced the same existential question, which was how to carry its users into the graphical era. Nantucket had already seen this coming and had been working on the answer, an internal effort called the Aspen Project, intended to produce a Windows-capable successor. Computer Associates took that work and shipped it as CA Visual Objects, and then it made the choice that almost completely severed all trust with its existing community. Visual Objects abandoned the X-based syntax, the language that Clipper developers had spent a decade mastering, the language upon which millions of lines of existing customer code was written in. All of that was gone with one new release. What made things even worse was there was no meaningful migration path. A developer with a large, working, profitable Clipper application could not carry it forward. They could only rewrite it in an unfamiliar language at their own expense on a product that was also expensive to buy. And as for the CA Visual Objects software, it arrived into a market where Microsoft was selling Visual Basic to nearly the same audience at exactly the same moment. So the developers did the only rational thing they could do. They kept running Summer 87 and Clipper 5, maintaining applications on a DOS tool while the rest of the world moved to Windows. Clipper never made the transition to Windows. By 1995, almost no new commercial applications were being written in it at all. Computer Associates released CA Clipper 5.3b on the 20th of May 1997, and that was the last version of Clipper that Computer Associates ever shipped. A tool that had been used to build millions of business applications, that had a fanatically loyal professional community, that had been genuinely excellent, was simply stopped. And here's where the story takes a turn. In 2004, Computer Associates was engulfed in one of the largest accounting frauds in the history of American business. The scheme was known internally by a phrase that tells you everything about the culture that produced it: the 35-day month. The practice of holding the company's books open past the actual end of a financial quarter, so that deals signed afterward could be counted as though they had closed on time, allowing the company to appear to have hit targets when in fact it had missed them. Over $2 billion in revenue was manipulated this way in 1999 and 2000 alone. Computer Associates agreed to pay $225 million in settlement. Multiple executives went to prison, and Sanjay Kumar, who had succeeded Charles Wang, the founder of CA, as chief executive, pleaded guilty to securities fraud, obstruction of justice, and in November of 2006, a federal judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison and an $8 million fine. Kumar had, among other things, tampered with a laptop to conceal its contents from investigators. Perhaps a company who had a reputation for buying and killing software may have been the first sign that maybe something wasn't completely above board in that corporation. And Clipper, in the end, refused to die because the developers who loved it did what the company that owned it would not, and built a free open source implementation of the language called Harbor, which runs on Windows, Linux, and macOS, which is still actively maintained today, and which can take that 30-year-old source code and compile it for modern machines. Those millions of applications did not have to be abandoned after all. But until next time, thank you for watching.